want to just dive into that a little bit more and understand, what are some of the things that SDK gives you, and how do you, get tenant isolation in that case from using the SDK?
Okay, so the idea is basically to help the developers access resources of tenants. We usually advocate for the pool model for tenants. So in DynamoDB, it would be one table for all tenants. And people can make mistakes. They can, in our Lambdas, you always have the context of one tenant, but maybe you have a bug, maybe the Lambda was warm and the context of the previous tenant was still active for some reason in the cache, whatever, and you use the previous tenant ID. Not good. You break tenant isolation. So we wanted to make sure that everybody uses the same library, that nobody needs to reinvent the wheel. It's used across the company. It's like very highly audited, security-related SDK. And we wanted to make sure that the dev experience is very simple and transparent. So essentially, you have the tenant ID somewhere. The tenant needs to be identified. So usually at the beginning of the Lambda, you will have another SDK for token validation to identify the JOT token of the tenant and extract the tenant ID, make sure that everything is okay. And what it does, it sets the tenant ID on the tenant isolation SDK. So now we know for sure this is the tenant ID for our session, for our context of the Lambda run. Now, when they do whatever they need to do in the Lambda, in the logic layer, whatever, at some point they need to access resources in DynamoDB or whatever service they need, right? We support for multiple services in AWS. For each service, we did a different magic, I call it. But basically, I mean, it's not magic. I mean, we're using it, we based it on AWS articles, like proper IAM. We're not doing anything weird or custom, just wrapping some mechanisms around IAM. So the idea is that the Lambda by itself, its role it cannot access the database of the tenants. Nothing, cannot do anything. The only way it can, I mean, ideally, if the developers, they follow the rules and they use the SDK, because obviously I can't force them. But if they do that, the only way for them to get about a client or about a table or about a resource to get to the table is to use the SDK. And the SDK requires basically a role that it needs to assume. And the role can do whatever that Lambda needs to do for the table. It has no restrictions. So if it needs to get items, it can get all the items. If it needs to put the items, it can put any item to the table. Now, for this to work, the primary key of the DynamoDB table needs to be some sort of tenant ID. It needs to be somewhere in there, like a prefix, suffix, whatever, but it needs to be there. And then the way it works, the SDK does assumes the role, and injects an inline dynamic policy and inserts we use the row level mechanism of DynamoDB for the leading keys, if you're familiar with it. And we inject the tenant ID into there. And we know the tenant ID because it was initialized at the beginning of the context. And that way, you get a client. We return you back a client with those credentials that we get for the assume row. And that way, even if you try to get an item and put in the tenant ID, a tenant ID that is not the current tenant ID, you're going to get an exception, not from my SDK, but from IAM, from Boto, like in the client error. So it's very transparent and very simple. That's the main idea. And for each different service, we did a different inline policy that will match whatever we need to do. Basically, okay. That's it. That's the magic.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because in that case, because the Lambda function's own IAM role doesn't have those permissions to access those tables and data, then you can also make sure that someone can't just forgot or someone don't realize that's how you access data in the CyberArk, and suddenly trying to, you've got a function that has access to lots more things. But if you restrict everything through the SDK, then you have this access pattern baked into how your code has to behave in order to get access to your tenant's data.